Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Gran. I am a bookseller at Garcia Street Books, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth edition of Literary Soundbites, a virtual platform created to join authors with the local readership here in Santa Fe and beyond. Today, I'm very excited to introduce Jenn Shapland, writer and archivist who lives here in New Mexico. Jenn has published many essays in numerous publications, ranging from Tin House to Southwest Contemporary to the Oprah magazine. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin, and in 2017, she won the Pushcart Prize for her essay titled Finders Keepers. Today, we'll be hearing from and talking about Jenn's first book, titled My Autobiography of Carson McCullers. It was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award, and I couldn't be more excited to be speaking with you about it today, Jenn. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, would you mind introducing the book a little bit?
Sure. My autobiography of Carson McCullers is it's a memoir, but it's also a biography. It kind of starts with my discovery of some letters between Carson McCullers, who's a writer from the 1940s, and a woman named Anne Marie Schwarzenbach. I found these letters while I was an intern in an archive in Austin, Texas, called the Harry Ransom Center. And these were love letters, and I kind of came upon them accidentally and just got totally hooked. Needed to understand who was Carson, who was Anne Marie, what was their deal. So I just kind of kept following that trail. I ended up cataloging Carson's personal effects, like her clothing and objects at the Ransom Center. I lived in her childhood home in Columbus, Georgia for a month. I followed her to Yaddo, which is the writing residency in upstate New York, where she wrote a number of her more famous books, like The Member of the Wedding. Along the way, I'd made a number of kind of big archival discoveries about her life. I read some therapy transcripts from the last years of her life. And kind of really got a much fuller picture of the story that she was trying to tell about herself in the series of unfinished autobiographies that she wrote during her lifetime.
Okay, so first I'd like to kind of introduce the question of what was your goal with the book, specifically maybe with querying the archive, or I mean, you've already gotten into it a little bit, but essentially like that. And if you'd like to kind of read a couple chapters or just one, and then we'll get more into the question, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, so I was going to read The High Line, which is a chapter that's kind of midway through the book. And this is when I'm in New York City. I'm at Yaddo kind of doing my research, and then I go to look at Yaddo's own archives at the New York Public Library. And then I'm sort of reflecting on that, and it's in this kind of very particular political moment, as you'll see. The High Line. I walked to Pat's apartment along the High Line to catch a ride back to Saratoga Springs, back to the place where I felt I could feel deeply without disruption. A billboard-sized copy of Zoe Leonard's poem, I Want a President, was pasted up on the wall, in front of which an older couple was taking their photo. The first line reads, I want a dyke for president, followed by, I want a person with AIDS for president, and I want a fag for president, and I want someone with no health insurance. The 2016 election was a few days away. I was walking along thinking about our first woman in office, how ready I felt for that, though the campaign had been a nightmare. Carson would have been furious at the rampant racism, unable to stand the misogyny directed at Hillary Clinton, or so deep inside my version of her mind, I imagined. It was hard to believe it was really happening, but I felt somehow entitled to a woman president. Now, years into Trump's presidency, I am learning yet again that history does not progress, does not move forward, cannot be understood as some sort of trajectory we can draw between past and future that goes through the present. Like when I look at the history that surrounded Carson, All I can see in our present moment is a scatterplot of points and a best fit line that never quite catches any of them. A lot of people talk about Carson McCullers as, quote, ahead of her time, given, I presume, her empathetic writing about gay men, interracial love, racism, and disability in the 1940s and 50s. But perhaps, in light of a recent election and its aftermath that signal the ongoingness of racist and homophobic and misogynistic and ableist bigotry, even during political moments that seem progressive, it feels more accurate to say that she was just plain empathetic to human differences, that it has nothing to do with history, with the times, with generation. When I read Carson's fiction, it is clear that empathy is a choice a person makes, moment to moment, in how they approach other people, on the page and off. I think I'll just stop there. I don't want to read too much. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Got a cat.
I think your work here accesses and deepens the space between biography and autobiography, and you have this interesting way of just as you document your own experiences, you're intertwining them with what's known about Carson McCullers, is really interesting. And so I was wondering, kind of like, what was motivating you during your writing when it came to actually writing the book itself, and how, like, were you trying to, you include at the end an interview where you talk about queering the archive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, how does your writing, like the format and the form, how does that help queer the archive? And why is that important right now?
Yeah, I think in the chapter that I just read the beginning of, you can kind of hear the frustration that I'm feeling at that point, and it's frustration that's political because it's right at the moment right before the 2016 election, but that it's also frustration that's coming directly from the research that I'm doing and the sort of barriers that I'm running up against, and so the kind of documentation that I'm looking for or that I'm trying to create of Carson's kind of queer identity, of her relationships with women. Every time I find, a new archive, I get more information, I get a clearer picture of that story, but then I also get things that contradict that narrative or things that call it into question. And so I was definitely feeling this frustration in my research that that not only had her life sort of been censored after the fact to make it really difficult to see what her sexuality kind of looked like, what her relationships looked like, who she was, how she understood her identity. All of that had sort of been papered over by biographers, but then reviewing these artifacts, reviewing these letters and things, I was able to see that a lot of the sort of quote unquote progress we envision, progress for, like, say, a feminist agenda or kind of equity between men and women, or a less homophobic society, like, none of those dreams were coming true in the world that I was living in, let alone in the world that she was living in. So it was almost like I kept seeing my own frustrations reflected in her life and vice versa. So then in terms of the form, which was your question, the book is these super short chapters. They're kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4-page long chapters. There's, I think, 80 of them. And I kind of kept them short and almost fragmented because I wanted to sort of document the absences that were a part of this story, all of the information that's missing, all of the things that I couldn't find out and that we'll never really know. Because that's the thing about queer history, that's the thing about queer archives, is that they're very partial, they're very fragmentary. You're having to dig back through and kind of read and interpret these codes and these euphemisms, but then you're also having to fill in a lot of gaps. And so the book became this combination of biography and autobiography, in part because where there was a gap in the narrative, where I couldn't fully get the story of what happened between Anne-Marie and Carson, for example. I was able to sort of imagine myself into that experience, into that relationship by reading the letters, and then reflect on the relationships that I'd been in, and I could actually understand the dynamic pretty well. So I was able to kind of use my experience as a queer person and as a closeted queer person in the present to kind of reflect back, project myself into these situations and flesh her narrative out more. So that's sort of how my story got woven in.
That's interesting. I was reading something that you'd written on Zadie Smith on her essay, or on Zadie Smith's The Shadow of Ideas. And I thought it was really interesting something that you wrote about writing essays and how they kind of, um, like you said, like the joy of writing it is that they don't need to move logically or chronologically, and that it kind of goes where it needs to go. And it seemed like it kind of gets a life of its own, and it's not necessarily for like the subject matter that you're writing about, nor for yourself. It kind of like, grows beyond that in a way. And I'm curious if that was something that you were thinking about while writing this book. And if so, has anyone approached you about your writing style or about the content and like acknowledged where they felt that it was an opportunity for them to fill in the gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that component of essay writing in particular comes through in my research for this book, and then in the way that I actually assembled it, which was very much the same way that I assemble a long form essay, by kind of cutting up all the pieces that I have or laying out all the pieces that I have and then trying to arrange them into a structure that will both make sense to me, but again, leave room for the reader to make these connections. So I'm not necessarily like holding your hand and telling you what each thing is supposed to mean to you, right? You're supposed to kind of figure that out for yourself. But yeah, I also think that any research process that you do is similar to writing an essay in that, like, yeah, you can try to predict where it's going to go. You can say, this is what I'm calling it and this is what it's about, but then by the time you get to the end, it's sort of something totally different than what you had imagined it would be. And that's certainly true with this book. I have a note in one of my journals from, I don't know, 2012, 2013, something like that, where I wrote, I want to write an autobiography of Carson McCullers. Because at that point I had just figured out like, oh, she kept trying to tell this story. She kept trying to write her autobiography. She never got it published. So someone's got to write this story. And so that's still the title. I think oftentimes I use titles, I kind of come up with the title before the project even exists. And it gives me like this place to point to say like, that's where I think I want to get. And then try to figure out what I need to assemble to create, this totally imaginary object, this totally imaginary idea of an autobiography of Carson McCullers. But yeah, I do think just like in that Zadie Smith essay, it kind of moves in some unexpected directions, maybe for the reader as well. And I have heard from some readers who like the fact that they can sort of make their own connections, that they can sort of follow the trail of breadcrumbs that I've left and draw their own conclusions. And then I've also seen like in the couple of Goodreads reviews that I read before I stopped reading those because it's not healthy. I do remember seeing people saying things like, this book is really fragmented and I'm having trouble following it or something like that, which is a totally reasonable thing to say. But obviously that's intentional. That's their own purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I could see how, yeah, people have funny things to say and interesting things to say as well. And it is unusual. So there is that. My next question for you is kind of like, there are, as you say, like 80 chapters, right? And so what was that like composing, like curating them and like making, putting them in an order that, was representative of like some sort of story? I mean, it does feel like you start and you end in that way, even though there are a lot of stops. But was there, like, for example, did you write some of the chapters that came towards the end of the book very early on, and things like that?
Yeah, I did. This kind of grew out of while I was working at this archive. I was in graduate school for something else, kind of doing this much more academic critical writing on a different subject. And I'm interning in this archive. And I just kind of, the interactions I was having with the objects I was finding, like Albert Einstein's molecular model kit, or like Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein's like stationery, things like that. The interactions I was having were so unusual and unique that I just sort of started writing little notes to myself as I was working. And they were kind of notes to the objects, questions for the objects. And a number of those actually appear in the book, kind of toward the middle of the book. These different questions for McCullers' objects, personal effects that I cataloged, her clothing, her eyeglasses, things like that. But so those chapters kind of took form very early on as these just short little responses I was having to these archival encounters. And then I kind of kept using that as my method. So as I continued to research, and I went to the house in Columbus, I sort of tried to continue to write these little responses that were very much immersed kind of in the context of my life, of my physical situation, where I am on the day. I'm here at this archive in Columbus looking at these therapy transcripts, or I'm here in Carson's house wondering whether or not I should sit on the couch. It just kind of continued to elaborate from that same interaction where I'm just like, here's me, here's the archival object, and here's me kind of just document briefly my interaction with it, with kind of as much context for my life and then historical context for Carson's life as I can sort of work in there. And by the end, I had all of these different chapters and I really didn't know what order they went in, but I had 5 of them that I had written very, very early on in the process. And I even gave a reading in Austin where I just read those 5. I didn't have anything else at that point. I just had those 5. And now the current version of, or the final version of the book, those 5 actually appear, but they kind of are scattered throughout. And the last chapter is the last one that I read that day years ago. So they almost formed these little like stepping stones across the book. So once I kind of figured out, okay, I have these 5, I need to just then kind of figure out how these other pieces fit in between them almost. And this was like physical process of cutting out the paragraphs, laying them on the floor, cats getting involved and walking through, scattering them around, and then just trying to find an order that made sense. And then of course having other people read them because I need, someone else to say, I'm really confused here, or like you just, skipped in time to a totally different place and location and part of your life. So you actually have to explain that, things like that. But yeah, so it was very much guided by the objects themselves and then sort of by this structure that appeared really early on in the process.
That's interesting. And it's kind of fun to imagine you cutting up these chapters. I mean, just how like written correspondence was kind of the thing that like, got you going, essentially, like the catalyst perhaps. And then that can be very overwhelming, especially if there's a lot of written correspondence that you're working through. But I think that your commentary on the material objects and how they kind of connected you to Carson McCullers is really interesting. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to read from a chapter where you kind of highlight the material objects.
Sure. I was going to read maybe a couple because these are short. So I'm going to start with one called Rules. And this is when I'm staying at Carson McCullers' house in Columbus, her childhood home. Rules. No one told me not to sit on the furniture. No one told me not to set up my sewing machine and lay out my chambray fabric on the living room table, scattering the carpet with dark blue threads. I would pick them up eventually. No one told me not to play the classical CD that was already in the boombox. Certainly, no one told me not to dance. No one told me not to unroll my yoga mat in the foyer and practice across from the huge, bad portrait of Carson over the mantel. No one told me not to sit on my kneeling desk chair I brought with me from home at the marble table where Carson lunched with her idol, Isak Dinesen, and Marilyn Monroe. No one told me not to open the drawers or find Carson's high school yearbook. Beside her black and white photo, it reads, Carson Smith, music, when soft voices die, vibrates in the memory. Carson's hair is slicked back and tucked behind her ears. Someone has curled the bottom under. She wears a dark jacket with a rumpled white lapel folded over it. She looks far away. And then let me read Portals. And this is again just one page chapter, but it's about the clothes that I cataloged at the Ransom Center. Portals. The clothes are a kind of hinge or portal to the author's body, to herself and her self-representation. Even my item-level descriptions of the personal effects give away an investment that was perhaps too intimate for my role as an intern. This straw hat has a black grosgrain ribbon band. The hat is misshapen, dirty, and worn, with tears on the side and top. This pair of socks is cable knit with cream wool. Both socks show wear on the soles of the feet. The other objects in the collection are a key to parts of her daily life, an inadvertently curated personal history I am left to decipher. What is the relationship between her bank books, her ink refills, and her mother's passport? Why this silver llama statue? Why this handkerchief with the recipe for Irish coffee? As I worked in my head, I wrote questions for the objects I found, musings that kept nagging at me unanswered.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that you have a lot of documentation of these musings where you were just thinking, is there like, could you even, I mean, do you know how many journals you took while you were doing your research and experiencing all those places?
Because it took place over such an extended period of time, I was probably researching from 2012 to 2016. It's really all over the place. So I still find, like, you know, on your computer, if you have a Mac, you have those little, like, the text edit section, and then on your phone you have your notes app, but then also, you know, and then also paper notebooks. I have notes about this all over the place. I keep journals pretty regularly, so I also have journals that kind of, you know, move through that period of my life. And so within the kind of reflecting on my own life, I'm also writing about these objects or writing about my encounters with things related to Carson, or insights I have or think I've had into this project. So as with kind of all of my research, it's all over the place. I couldn't ever really count it.
It is interesting how something so small as like a silver llama statue can be something that you sit there and ruminate on for a long period of time. And you wrote about your experience with like the pizza delivery person, which is funny. And I'm curious, were there any other moments where you were like received while you were doing your research, and just kind of like how did that go exactly, you know, with just kind of being in her space essentially?
Yeah, I described this, I think, somewhere in the book, but they had a couple of events at the house while I was staying there, because the house is technically a museum. And so it's not like open to the public, but they do hold like special events there. So they had a reading one night, they had a marimba concert one night, and those were just the strangest experiences, because I would come up from my bedroom, which was this kind of basement back room at the house. I'd come upstairs into the kitchen, and there would be all these strangers there. And I would be sort of like emerging from the bowels of the house. And they'd be like, who are you? You know, and there was, you know, the director was there somewhere, and he knew I was there. I was supposed to be there. But at the same time, they have writers in residence at the Carson McCullers house in Georgia. They have this fellowship for writers and musicians that's named after Carson's sister and her nephew. And they have these official residents. They kind of do public readings with them, and they put their, names on their website and stuff so everyone knows they're there. But I was there in this very unofficial capacity. They kind of allowed me to come, but for some reason that was never totally explained to me, they just didn't give me the official residency. So I was like unofficial secret resident. So it was even stranger than to have like the whole English department at Columbus State University walk in and be like, who are you? What are you doing in the house? Super strange. But yeah, those experiences. And the neighbors too. I always found myself wondering, what are these neighbors who live next door to this historic home think when there's someone inhabiting it?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's funny to think about. Did you interact with anybody who was related to the McCullers family, or like anybody, or to Carson McCullers, and then, or anyone who had like stories or anecdotes from other people in town, kind of like about her or her family?
I did a little bit, during those little house parties, I would encounter people no one who had known her directly, but people who had known the family. And then I also had some interactions with the McCullers estate, and they actually refused permissions for me to use quotations from her unpublished works. Which after some sleuthing, we kind of determined is probably because she has one living relative. It's a nephew, and it's her brother's son. And he's the only living relative, but he does seem to have a lot of control over the use of her materials and her legacy. So I still don't really know the total reason why they refused permissions. I have my own theories about that, but that was kind of, again, I never met the nephew, I never talked to him, but I kind of know that he was behind the scenes sort of, or is still behind the scenes pulling the strings for the estate. But I will also say, this is funny to me, the Carson McCullers Center now has a podcast of their own, and they just invited me to be on it. So I'm like, oh, how interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, that is
I know.
interesting.
I'm like, what are they going to ask me?
Yeah, because I'm assuming you haven't heard from this nephew. I mean, if
I
you
have
haven't met
not.
him.
I have not. I know that the estate was unhappy that the book was going to be published. I think this happens a lot actually. And I was just talking to a scholar who's researching the estates of women writers in the 20th century and kind of how their legacies basically get sort of placed under control of relatives or of lawyers, things like that. People like Willa Cather and Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, and I just forgot what I was going to say. It was something funny. Oh, the estate, and it'll come back to me.
That's totally cool. That's fine. And that kind of helps us move into the next question I have for you, like the estates essentially. But I was really intrigued by the way you kind of used place throughout the book. It like often it seemed like a vehicle for you to kind of acknowledge how you were feeling while researching Carson McCullers, and kind of like bring your own self, your own identity, and your own like history into it as well. And I am curious about what, like how you did that or why you did that. And if you would like to read from your book one more time, that would be awesome. And then we can talk about it.
Sure. I think I'm going to read this chapter called Caves at the beginning, where I think I'm doing this thing that you're talking about. Caves. After finding the therapy transcripts, I drove back to Carson's house through a cloud of yellow-green pollen from trees and heavy flour. I had come to Columbus to be alone, to experience McCullers' town and home, thinking that perhaps the buildings themselves, the trees, the streets, would reveal what I couldn't find in published writings about her. The foundation that manages Carson's house had offered me a chance to stay there, And then the timing wasn't perfect. I was in my last semester of graduate school and hadn't finished the dissertation I'd be defending in a month. This residency seemed too good to pass up. I was also in the flesh of new love and couldn't believe I was choosing to be alone in Georgia for 4 weeks. I hadn't quite grasped that I would be living in a museum. When I arrived at the Stark Avenue house and glanced around at its closed floral curtains soaked in dust and its sun-faded fan art paintings of Carson's face, I panicked. I suddenly felt alone, scared, unsure why I'd come all the way here and planned to stay a month. What connection did I have to Carson, really? I'd read so much about her, but all I knew of her in 3 dimensions were the objects of hers I'd found at the Ransom Center. The shape of her feet in wool knee-high socks, the patina of her skin on an old cigarette lighter. Here, she felt like a whole person I could neither see nor touch. I became afraid that in the very process of trying to know her, I would somehow change her. Perhaps I'd been expecting her to keep me company, but needless to say, Carson wasn't there. Nor was she in any of the books I'd been devouring about her since I'd read the Anne Marie letters. This project, this hunt for the Carson of Anne Marie's letters, had seemed at a distance like a useful escape from my dissertation and from the bleak academic job market. Now that I was padding around her house in socks, surrounded by her things, I felt daunted. I thought I would use my own life as a writer, as a queer person, as a chronically ill person, to tell Carson's untold story. But after reading the therapy transcripts, I realized that she'd already told it. I called Chelsea and informed her I wasn't going to be able to stick it out. All the rooms were dark, the house strange and musty. What am I demanded. The living dead? It was late February 2016, and too many of the neighboring lawns bore signs for nightmare right-wing candidates. Chelsea talked me down, reminded me that it always takes a few beats to get used to a new space. I went to the grocery store. I bought orange lilies and a basil plant and things to eat. When I woke the next morning, the kitchen glowed with sunlight. The green things helped remind me that I too was a living thing. I was the one bringing life to this project. Lying in bed in the downstairs library, a wood-paneled carpeted addition to the house I called my cave, I read an interview with Eileen Miles that offers writing, self-exposure or self-representation as an antidote to or an action of loneliness. Quote, you tell it because you're lonely. You're the only person inside that life, unquote. I wrote in my journal, I always have to find my own way into things. Whatever is here, I will make it myself from scratch. I will find it and assemble it or unbuild it. Within a few days, I started taking walks in the neighborhood. There's a park a few blocks down the hill called Little Wildwood, with huge trees and a sizable stone pyramid I assumed was a monument. When I crossed the park and approached the pyramid, I found no inscription or explanation for it, a glaring metaphor for the blankness I was feeling. The neighborhood is a cluster of old homes, some of them mansions, though not Carson's. It reminded me of my hometown, a wealthy suburb on the North Shore of Chicago where I never quite fit in. When I first read Carson's fiction, sitting behind various desks in the Ransom Center, I felt an immediate connection to the small southern towns where her characters, often adolescents, strongly sense their own unbelonging and isolation. The suburbs of the Midwest of my childhood in the 1980s and 90s resemble Columbus in their fondness for gossip, their sense of tradition, their prizing of normalcy at all costs, not to mention their tacit racism and homophobia. I didn't meet and rarely saw any of the neighbors while I was in Columbus, though I frequently wondered what they thought of me strolling their empty streets, reading on the front porch, where by all appearances no one had sat in years. Outsiderness is a stance. Yeah, so I mean, in that section, the description of place, so the description of the pollen and Columbus and the streets, for me, it connected to my hometown in Chicago. And this was kind of one of the early connections that I felt with Carson after reading those letters. Once I really started getting into her fiction, I felt such a kinship with her characters, like with Frankie in Member of the Wedding, and Mick in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, who are these young girls who don't really fit in, who are in these small towns where everyone's kind of keeping an eye on them. All of that just felt so recognizable to me, and so similar to the place where I grew up. And so even though, I'm not from the South, and at that point, when I was first reading her fiction, I'd never even spent time in Georgia. I just felt totally seen by these descriptions, by these characters, and I felt this like different sense of possibility. I always say that I wish that I could have had those books when I was an adolescent. I think it would have been really powerful to read, living where I did and kind of not really understanding my own queerness, my own identity, things like that. I think it would have been really helpful. So yeah, those descriptions of place, they also kind of help me access my own feelings. Sometimes I get very in my head, especially when I'm researching something. So describing the physical scenario that I'm in can kind of help me think about, okay, this is what I'm actually feeling emotionally about what's happening.
That makes sense. I feel like that was just, I really like that chapter. And since you read from portals, I think that really speaks to just kind of like how material objects can function as portals. They can take you totally different places, but so can place. And so you do a
Yeah,
really good job with that. So thank you.
thank you.
And yeah, sure. And then just kind of like my final question for you, still related to place, is that Santa Fe is, I mean, this might be a little bit strong, but it is kind of a character here in this book. It's not like any of the other places really that you write about, if that makes sense. Not to say that they aren't each unique and individual, but that's something that a lot of our readers here can relate to. And so I'm curious, really, like, how do you see Santa Fe with your relationship with Carson McCullers? And do you find things here that make you revisit your research in an interesting way, even though your book has already been published?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that I live here now is because I wrote this book, weirdly. Like it's kind of hard to understand, hard to kind of trace out like the ways in which my life changed once I started writing this. But one of the biggest ways was that, even though I was on the academic job market and finishing my PhD, I had decided, while writing this book, and really that same year that I went and stayed in Carson's house, early 2016, that I didn't want to be an academic because I wanted to finish this book and because I was starting to really see myself as a writer. So my partner and I were trying to decide where to move from Austin at that point, and we had been on a road trip. This is like so many people's Santa Fe story, but we'd been on a road trip from Austin to the Spiral Jetty in Utah and came back through Santa Fe. And we got snowed in, so we had to stay here an extra night, and it was beautiful in the snow. And the place seemed so remote and so unique, whereas Austin felt very crowded. It was kind of being overrun by the tech industry. And so we kind of, it came up in our discussions of where to move as almost a joke, like maybe we should move to Santa Fe. But then it became, as we continue to talk about it and think about it, like what a perfect place to go and try to write, what a perfect place to go and try to do something creative, and also to sort of take a step back from the busier world that we've both been a part of. And that's really what my life here has been like. So Santa Fe shows up in a few places in the book, none of the places I read today, but Natalie Goldberg shows up in the book when I read her book at Yaddo. And then since I've moved to Santa Fe, I've kind of become friends with her unexpectedly, because she's friends with another friend of mine. And then I also talk a little bit about my friendship with Harmony Hammond, who's an artist, a lesbian artist who lives in Galisteo. And I was house sitting for her while doing the revisions on this book. So that comes up as well. So there is kind of this connection. And, I think there's like a living in a small isolated place connection, maybe to what I was talking about a minute ago, except in this case, it's a small isolated place that is, for the most part, very welcoming, and very conducive to being an artist, conducive to being a queer person, and to kind of finding community in that.
Natalie, she's in the store often, and she does, it's kind of fun because she does use this book as like a way to talk about what made her start writing. So that's kind of like a really neat portal, if you will, when you're a book yourself. Yeah. So, but anyway, well, thank you, Jen. I think we're going to end it here.
Okay.
And thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking part and just love the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed this.